Hey, what is going on, you guys? Hope you're all doing amazingly well. And today I wanted to talk about female pop vocal chains, which is a really big topic because you want to make your vocals sound the best they can, or your artist's vocals sound the best they can sound. And there's just some typical things I think people tend to overlook about vocal chain. So what I want to do is first play the stem, the vocal stem you can see up here above in purple, and then play it through my vocal chain, and then talk about some things that I think are really useful to know about.
Hostage, now your lover, hidden under covers. You only love me when you wake up. Is it me or am I not enough? Then you leave and I'm hollow. Some days I get so low, there has to be a way out.
Okay, now let's listen to the vocal with this vocal chain.
Hostage, now your lover, hidden under covers. You only love me when you wake up. Is it me or am I not enough? Then you leave and I'm hollow. Some days I get so low, there has to be a way out.
So there's a couple really good main things that you want to do with a vocal chain, especially for pop, because I would say you want to start off with your EQ. Even if you've recorded the vocal really well, you tend to have to find a balance, especially in pop genres, where you have to sort of tame the low mids, like the mids, the lower mids, and then cleaning up the bass here on the left. And a lot of times a vocal EQ curve, it doesn't look exactly like this, but it tends to kind of be something like this, right? You're sort of balancing out the mid-range and the low mid-range stuff. Now, is it possible to like record a vocal where this is absolutely not what you want to do? Yeah, it's always a case-by-case basis, but if I was looking for like patterns that happen when I'm doing a vocal chain, this is definitely it. And if you're on Ableton Live Lite, you don't have access to this EQ, so you can't use EQ8, and that's one of the big reasons why, if you're wondering like if I should get Ableton Standard or Suite, this is a big reason why. You want a good EQ that gives you a lot of precision. And a lot of times when I'm doing that first EQ in a vocal chain, I'm actually using like every single one of these nodes because I'm trying to shape the mid-range area to be very specific to get rid of, pesky frequencies. And that could be like frequencies like, stuff below 80 hertz you generally are not going to need, or, 350 hertz can be, a little too muffly sounding, or 500 or 550 hertz can be very boxy sounding. And that's kind of what you're seeing in this area here. And I'm using all the different nodes to really shape the curve the way I want it to look. And then I'm kind of boosting the upper frequencies, especially stuff above 10,000 hertz, if I feel like it's adding a nice amount of brightness to her voice. And this could really apply to any singer, male or female. A lot of times these pesky mid-range frequencies, they're just too much of them there. Now, if I take everything off here and I just play her vocal before all the other stuff happens, but I turn on my EQ, we can hear the dramatic difference that this makes in her vocal sound. So without that first EQ, this is what it sounded like.
Hostage, now your lover, hidden under covers.
Now on.
Hostage, now your lover, hidden under covers.
Let's do it again.
Hostage, now your lover. Hostage, now your lover.
You might kind of hear it as like, it's a big difference, right? There's a lot of the mid-range frequencies are now tamed and cleaned up a little bit. And this really helps with the sound. And even times when you think it might be a little thin sounding because we've lost some of the body of the mid-range, the stuff that happens later on in the chain can definitely supplant that. So here I have a compressor, and this is sort of just here to kind of clean up the dynamics in the vocal performance. And then we have the audio effect rack, which is running everything parallel. So you could see here, I have the compressor. And by the way, if you want to download this vocal chain, I always post them in the links in my description below. I make a lot of stuff in Ableton and FL Studio. So if you're interested in just downloading this or getting a standard or light version, which I made for this as well, you can get that down below. But if I go through my audio effect rack, you can see I've got the compressor here in a totally different style. So right here, you've got the ratio there and it's kind of cleaning it up. But on here, I have makeup gain on and the threshold pulled all the way down. So what this is basically doing is kind of crushing her vocal sound. It's a really crushed, compressed sound. And that's why you can see that yellow line is really dramatically dipped down to show a massive amount of compression happening on her voice. And then I just mix it in using this little volume fader. This little blue bar over here is basically like a little mini mixer. And I just kind of mix that in. That kind of supports her voice. So you have a compressor for kind of cleaning up the dynamic range, and you have a compressor that's sort of smashing it and mixing it in underneath to support the presence of her voice. Goes a long way. And then I have a color limiter. This is new to Ableton Suite. So if you don't have Ableton Suite, you might want to use like a standard version. You could use like the saturator instead. This thing's amazing though, because I use it in a similar way to the compressor. I use the loudness maximizer to like really smash the dynamics out of her voice, and then add like saturation and color. And this really beefs up the sound. And then I have chorus ensemble, and this is like a stereoizing effect. So it's very like subtle. It's just kind of pushing her voice out. And I use this as well. And by the way, if you're familiar with chorus ensemble in Ableton, it has a width feature. And normally by default, it's on 100%. I find when I push this all the way up, it creates a dramatically different stereo effect. So you definitely want to experiment with that as well. It's kind of a secret, I think, to chorus ensemble that a lot of people overlook. But also when you look at the audio effect rack, notice how every single thing that I do, I have it either fully wet, or in the case of color limiter, you don't even have a dry wet option. So everything is 100% wet. The reason why is because I'm going to mix it all in using this little mixer area over here. That's a big deal. And then after that, a lot of people overlook this idea. I have another EQ. And it's a similar looking idea to the other one, right? If we look at them side by side, this one, you can kind of see this is a little more dramatic looking. But then after all of this parallel processing, I'm doing a similar thing. I'm sort of taming some of the mid-range there, giving it a little more brightness and air to it. And the reason for that is, if you think about it, when people first learn how to do parallel processing with Audio Effect Rack, or, on an FL Studio mixer routing to other tracks, they tend to forget the fact that they are stacking signal onto each other. So it's very likely that that's going to change your EQ balance after you stack a bunch of parallel compression or saturation or distortion or chorus onto the sound. It's going to make the vocals sound thicker, but it might also pull the EQ balance a little bit back out of balance, right? So I went back in after all of that and I did some more EQ. And then I'm using Dynamic Tube. This is a really cool plugin. You get this in Ableton Standard, by the way. You don't have to have Suite. And I actually use this with a negative envelope, so it works more like an expander, which is really great for, kind of adding some dynamic saturation to her vocals. And I'm also kind of mixing it in with the dry wet knob there. And then one last big thing with, vocals obviously is the effects. And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll put time-based effects like reverb and echo on its own audio effect rack, because a lot of times when you're mixing a track, you actually might want to go into automation mode and automate the volume line for things like reverbs and delays. And that's a really big deal. Another thing that people overlook about this idea is you might actually want to put a compressor after a reverb. So in my vocal chain, it's like really light. But what I actually tend to do is I'll put a compressor after this and I'll set it to sidechain from itself. So basically when she's singing, I can duck out the reverb. And it's very easy to do. You can see here, I'm just using, I turn on sidechain and I select the track that her vocal is on. And that way the reverb actually ducks out of the way when she sings. I'll hold down Control and just drag this over to the echo area and do the same exact thing. So if you ever want to go heavy with echo and reverb, I didn't really do that in this vocal chain, but let's say you want to turn these volumes way up, you would actually do well to kind of duck them out of the way when her dry signal, when she's singing. So that's also kind of a neat little trick. But yeah, I like the sound of Vocal Hall from Ableton Reverb. And I use Echo, which is a sweet device, I think. But a lot of people don't even realize that you have an EQ line down here for your Echo. So you can clean up the low end on your Echo and use mid-side mode. So that's another tip that a lot of people don't even really know about. They always just turn this thing on and by default it's in stereo mode. But if you go to mid-side, it pushes things out and you can EQ it and kind of clean it up a little bit, which is also super useful. Now, real quick, I just want to interject here because I mentioned that I've done this with Ableton Lite modules only as well. And that's kind of the big thing. Like, you don't have EQ8, you have EQ3, or you don't have the dynamic tube, or, you know, you might not have echo. Instead, you just have like kind of the basic delay. The cool thing about this is that if you like using these modules like EQ3 or just the kind of standard delay in Ableton, they're totally viable. If I turn this off and just play it without any processing, we can hear the original version of the vocal.
Hostage, now your lover, hidden undercover.
Now the chain.
Hostage, now your lover, hidden undercover.
So you can hear it's a lot more clear sounding. And I haven't really had to sacrifice a whole lot, just maybe the precision of the EQ curve, because this is a parametric EQ. You don't have like that same visual feedback, and you only have really 3 knobs. You can pinpoint it a little bit with selecting the frequencies down here on the bottom, but you do have less control than with EQ8, right? So that's the main trade-off if you're thinking of upgrading to Ableton Standard that you would have to deal with. But you can hear, you know, this chain still makes a huge difference in the sound, right? So, you know, that's a lot of times what you're trying to do in a vocal chain. You're trying to clean up the EQ curve, create a lot of clarity and dynamic control and make it very dynamically consistent, and add effects that are balanced and sound good, right? So same exact thing, but with just Ableton Lite stuff. So yeah, feel free to check the link in the description below if you want to download this and try it for yourself. I did make like a standard and an Ableton Lite version, which are going to sound a little bit different, but you basically get the idea. And a lot of these techniques just really come in handy for getting the vocals to sit the way you want them to. And again, the EQ line is going to be really case by case, but a lot of times you see it look something like this. Like, it sort of is, this one looks a little dramatic on screen, but you know, you're dipping out the lows and you're beefing up the highs. Really, the only thing that Ableton Live or Ableton Live Suite is lacking right now is a dynamic EQ feature, because at certain points in a vocal, depending on the note that the singer sings or where his or her head is in relation to the microphone, there's going to be more or less bass or mid-range in the sound. So dynamic EQ is really useful for that. Right now, Ableton just doesn't really have that. That's why a lot of music producers will go out and buy something like a Fab Filter Pro Q3 or whatever it's called. You know, these sort of more advanced third-party EQs. But I gotta say that if you're using all the nodes on EQ8, you can really get your EQ curve to kind of like be where you want it to be. So I hope you guys found this video useful. Check the link in the description below if you want to try this for yourself. And yeah, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe if you want to learn more about music production topics, especially mixing and music stuff. So always happy to put these videos for you guys. I want to thank my Patreon supporters so much for their support. It really means a lot. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next video. And as always, have fun making music.